After wishing everyone good morning and a good Hanukkah, whatever left the last few hours, one of the issues that comes up in Parshas Miketz, and Rabbi Simcha takes a stand on this issue, is who was Paro and what motivated Paro to appoint Yosef as the viceroy of Egypt. Some say that Paro was a great man and he had Paro was a great man and he had very altruistic motives. He was a dreamer in and of himself, and he accepted Yosef's dream. But others say that he had other motivations. And let's take a look at Rameir Simcha. We're looking in Perek Mem Aleph, in Parshas Miketz, Pasuk Lamed Zayin. And the Pasuk says, Vayitav hadover b'einei Paro u'b'einei kol avadav. So if we take a look at the context of this Pasuk, and we see what found favor in the eyes of Paro, it was the idea that Yosef would be the second in command. Says Rameir Simcha, Al Yado, in Paro's mental state, in his understanding, in his evaluation of the situation, Al Yado, through Yosef, Nischazko Memshalto, his control, his sovereign rulership would become stronger, more intense. Vehugdash ma'aloso b'nei hamon. And Paro was seeking, like any leader, the admiration of his people. And here Rameir Simcha adds another word, not only hugdal, not only to glorify his memchol, but also hugdash. In a sense, it would sanctify his milah in the eyes of the people. Why? Shelokim, it's only the divine, megalalo asidos miyatzo bichalom. It's because of Paro's special status and his lofty relationship with the Almighty that God revealed to him what would happen in the future. And this was all a cover-up for the fact that it was really Yosef who was bringing the interpretation and the divine word. But in the eyes of the people, it would look as if it was Paro himself. And therefore, it was very common in the old civilizations, ancient life, that they would uplift and sanctify their leaders. And therefore, Paro declared, al Beisi. What does it mean, al Beisi? You will be in charge of my house. Ki hanhogas hamedina binyanim pnimiyim panagasa binyanim chitzoniyim hakol al picha. In truth, everything that's going to happen, all the architectural engineering and the supervision, all the administration, whether it is internal or external matters for government, it will all come through you. But which means mimcha eye gadol b'nei ha'am. In other words, Rameir Simcha is offering a second interpretation. Not only does it mean that I, Paro, will be one up on you, I'll have a rulership role that's greater than yours, but it means more than that. Egdal mimcha, which means I'll be greater through you. Mimcha eye gadol b'nei ha'am. As a result of you, it makes sense now, says Paro, that I should appoint you because you're going to be my loyal second in command. Your interest will be to uplift my stature and my image like the Sheni B'nei Hamon. And in fact, Yosef took an oath to the effect, Chei Paro. Chei Paro means let Paro live. Live here means a spiritual kind of uplifted dedication and sanctification. The ode, and furthermore, Chazal tell us, and we'll see this later on in Rameir Simcha, that Paro knew languages, but he didn't know Lashon HaKodesh. And that would be embarrassing in the fact that Paro did not know a language, but Yosef would conceal that fact. V'kones kol admas Mitzrayim leParo. Everything that Yosef did, all his administration, all his economic control was done on behalf of Paro. So it was a very good idea And it worked out beautifully for Paro that Yosef would be second in command, because in truth, all the decisions would be made by Yosef, but nobody would know that, because Hakise Egno Mimcha. Egno Mimcha means that through you, my rulership, my stature, my image in the eyes of the people will be that much greater. In the next piece in Rav Meir Simcha here, Mem Aleph Osik Lamites, Achrei Hodia Elokim Oscha, Ein Navon V'Chacham Kamocha. Now, many of the Mefarshim here will address the question of what's the difference between the word Navon and the word Chacham, and that leads to a great literature, but that's not the focus of the Meshech. What he's interested in is the relationship between the Reisha and the Seifa. The opening part of the pasuk indicates that God has revealed Oscha, you, and the emphasis here is on the word Oscha. There's something about you that's very, very unique, and as a result, it caused that God should reveal the truth and the future to you. And then at the end of the pasuk, Ein Navon Chacham Kamocha, as if to say that I have approved from the fact that God revealed all these secrets to you, you must be the greatest wise person. No one could size up to your wisdom. What's the relationship here, asks Rabbi Simcha by implication, between the Reisha and the Sefer? Now, in order to appreciate this presentation, I think we need the following introduction. Very often, you'll see in the Meshech Chochma that he will interpret a pasuk based on Chazal, based on Torah Sheba'al Peh. And in this case, Rabbi Simcha is going to invoke a principle that is formulated by the Gemara Meshech Nedarim. And it's very hard to believe that Paro was aware of the Gemara Nedarim, besides which there were no manuscripts at that time. But what I mean on a deeper level is that Rabbi Simcha in his commentary on the Torah understands the Torah on two different levels. On one level, we have to understand the psychology, we have to understand the reality of what's going on a very down-to-earth level. But once the words of anyone, even if it's Paro, are incorporated into the eternal Torah for all eternity, then the words take on a different meaning. And they can now be interpreted in the light of Torah. So that it could be that Paro formulated the words based on his psychological state of mind, but once it's incorporated into the Torah, it takes on a new meaning, and that's where the Meshech Chochma comes to the fore, to try to look through the eyes of the broader spectrum of Torah to shed a new light on a pasuk. How did Paro know that Yosef's intellect was superior? And the answer is because Chazal formulate the following principle. There are three preconditions, three attributes that are absolutely necessary for what we call Hashras Hashchina. To have any sort of level of prophecy, you've got to be, number one, a Chacham. Number two, you have to be an Asher. And number three, you have to be a Gibor. Now, we don't know how large were Yosef's biceps, but let's assume that he was average height. He wasn't necessarily pumping iron 3 times a day. He certainly wasn't an Asher. We took him out of jail to stand up in front of Paro. So then, Achar Shodiacha, if God has revealed to you, it means Oscha, you must be something special. You are above the norm for Hashras Hashchina. The norm for Hashras Hashchina requires A, B, and C, these three attributes. You only have one out of the three. And the only way that we can understand that your Chochma would facilitate Ruach HaKodesh Hashras Hashchina would only make sense if your Chochma is so great, your intellect is so superior, that in a sense it replaces the other two requirements that are necessary preconditions for Nevuah. And in the language of Rabbi Simcha, quoting the Gemara in Nedarim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Mashra Shchinaso El Chacham Gibor V'Yashir V'Im Kain Im Haya Yosef Mushlam B'Malol Se'ela if somebody would argue that Yosef had all these three extra attributes, then maybe his Chochma is not so great. There may be greater, more brilliant people in the land. He's an average Chacham. But together with his Ashirus, plus add to that he's a Givar, he's got all three attributes. And therefore, if Yosef would have had all three attributes, Ki b'chachma, as far as his level of wisdom is concerned, Hema, the other Chachamim, are Gedolim Yosef Imenu. They are greater in Chachma than he is. And Paro adduced the following logical argument. How could it be that there are other Chachamim that are greater than him, and he's only the average Chacham Yosef, and he's lacking the other two midos? It could be that there are other more brilliant people, but they weren't zocher to Hashem revealing the truth. Paro had many different interpreters of the dream, but none of them had this Ruach HaKodesh. So it could be, again, the reason why the others were not successful in achieving this level of Hashras Hashchina is because although they were greater in Chachma than Yosef, but they weren't as great as him in Ashirus and in Gvura. But now that he sees that Hodia Hashem Elokecha Oscha and Atav Beis Hasurim v'Chasa Lecha Milos Ha'elu, you don't have the Milos of Gvura and Ashirus. Is betach, it must be that Gadalta b'Chachma b'Kol Chachmei Dorcha. Why is it that you were chosen Oscha for this Gilui, for this revelation from above, and the others were not? It's because your Chachma is so superior. Your intellect supersedes by far that of the others, so that offsets the fact that you don't have the other two qualifications, although they may have the other two qualifications, but your Chachma is the greatest. And Kutshabricha Yoev Chachmasa Lechachamim. Rabbi Simcha at this point quotes a statement of the Medrash that God gives Chachma to those who have already the potential, the propensity for wisdom. Lakach Hodia Oscha. Therefore, God has chosen you specifically as the one to receive this revelation from above, so that you can interpret the dreams and will know the future. Let's take a look at another few small pieces in Rabbi Simcha until we get to the big fish for today. We're looking now in Perek Mem Aleph, Pasuk Mem He. Rabbi Simcha has a particular approach to the question as to why Paro chose this Osnat to be the wedding partner of Yosef. And you can come up with many, many different answers, but the Torah goes out of its way to say, Vayitein lo. It was Paro's decision, es Osnat. Yitochen, Rabbi Simcha suggests that what Paro was concerned with was the fact that Yosef had been taken out of jail after the very serious accusations against him in the mice of the episode of Eshes Potiphar. And Paro was afraid that the people in a grassroots kind of revolutionary movement would rise up, and who would be at the head of this revolution, of this rebellion? It would be none other than Potiphar, because again, he wants to cover up for his wife Eshes Potiphar. And the masses of the people, the Hamonah, would come forward and say, you, Yosef, you're appointing Yosef as the second in command? You're giving him all this honor and dignity and power? How could it be? He's a low scoundrel. He's guilty of the lowest crimes. So as a very sharp diplomatic political move, Paro decides to defeat these potential adversaries. So what does he do? He wants that Lo Yevazu Mitzrayim, the Mitzrayim won't be able to humiliate Yosef, to downgrade him in the eyes of the people. Umi Hema Makir, who in the Egyptian society would be the most likely candidates to be Mavaza Yosef, would certainly be Beis Adonov. That's where the entire episode and the guilt happened, the crime. And therefore, what he did was, as a political move, was he gave the daughter of base Adon, of the Adon of Potiphar, gave her to Yosef as a marriage partner. Therefore, Potiphar would not be interested in a claim against his own son-in-law. Now, it's interesting. In the next paragraph, Rabbi Simcha builds a theory based not on a word in the Torah, which he usually does, but based on the absence of a word. Interesting. Not only when we read the Torah do we have to see what the Torah says, but also what the Torah omits. The pasuk describes giving the name of Menashe by Yosef to his oldest son. And when you read the pasuk, it seemed like a classic. The etymology of a name indicates some sort of a declaration and a meaning which is formulated by the parent, whether it's the father or the mother. And that's exactly what Yosef does. Why is the name Menashe chosen? Ki nishani Elokim, because God has spared me in the low slavery of Mitzrayim. Simcha is one word missing. The lo kasuv, he amar, ki nishani Elokim. The word amar is the appropriate word. Now, in order to appreciate this, we take out a chumash, and we'll look at one example. And this is the parsha of the name giving of the Shvatim. Let's open up to Perek Chavtes in Parshas Vayetze, pasuk Lamed Beis. So I'll just read to you the pasuk, but again, you could bring many such psukim. It says, Vatar Leah Vatelid Ben Vatikrish Mo Ruven Ki Amra, because she declared Ki Ra Hashem Bi'ani, etc., etc. So the word Amar, or the feminine Amra, is always there to indicate that there was a declaration that was formulated by the parent, and then from that declaration we extract the name, and that word focuses on one of the words. Here, the Torah and Yosef omits the word Amar. Why is that so? And here we come back to a point that we made earlier. Chazal say that Yosef covered up for Paro regarding his ignorance of Lashon Kodesh. Paro lo yada Lashon Kodesh, Yosef nishbalo shelo yigalelo. Yosef was committed in his loyal friendship to Paro that he would never reveal the fact that Paro had this char b'haskala, as we'd say. If Yosef would have made a declaration that Kinishani Elokim, and therefore I'm giving the name Menashe, Paro would have no clue what it's all about. So as a cover-up for Paro, he kept this to himself. And, you know, when a person speaks to himself, no one else can hear it, Kinishani Elokim, and he gave the name Menashe. No one knew why the name Menashe was chosen, because Yosef kept it as a secret. Now I want to give you a big fish for today, and that's the next piece in Reb Meir Simcha. By way of introduction, Reb Meir Simcha always calls attention to words, and especially when one word all of a sudden disappears and another word pops up and substitutes for it. And every word in the Torah, says Reb Meir Simcha, is critical and has a lesson. So what we're going to see now in this next piece, which you'll see here, Perek Mem Beis, pasuk Zayin, is Reb Meir Simcha wearing two hats. The hat of what I call Pshuto Shel Mikra, pointing out the choice of words. Let's be meticulous, read the Torah carefully. Why does the Torah use this word here and changes the same word and replaces it with a synonym elsewhere? And the hat of a Baal Halacha, of the halachist, the lamdan that he was. Yosef recognizes his brothers when they first appear, and he interrogates them. He says, "What are you doing here? Why did you come?" And their answer was, "We came from Eretz Canaan, Lishbar Ochel." So let's emphasize the word Ochel. Later on, we're going to find a different word that replaces ochel, and that's going to be the word bar, beis reish. For example, we're going to find later on when the Torah describes Yosef collecting all the food from the 7 years of plenty, it says, Vayitzbar bar kechol hayam. The word bar, not ochel, but bar. Or, for example, later on when Yosef sends his brothers back to father Yaakov, it's going to say bar. Again, nosos bar. Here, when Yosef asks the brothers, where'd you come from and for what purpose? They said, bar ochel. We came for the purpose of lishbar ochel. So Rabbi Simcha wants to know, first and foremost, what's the difference between ochel and bar? And once we understand the difference between these two terms, then to try to figure out when each term is used in its context. This in and of itself is a project for a PhD thesis. What's the difference between ochel and bar? They're synonymous terms. So Meir Simcha quotes the halacha of Trumas and Maisris, and he uses that as a prism, as a spectrum through which we can understand the difference between these two so-called synonymous terms. Ochel is something that's in a developed stage, whereas bar is something that's in a very raw stage. Bar, he says, is a reference to what we call shibolim. Shibolim are stalks, grains, before they are processed at all. They're in their natural state. Ochel is when you've taken the shibolim and you've done something to the shibolim, which we'll describe in just a minute, that brings them closer to the ultimate goal of crushing them, making a flour out of them, and finally baking them as bread. What is the critical difference between bar and crossing the boundary to ochel? In halachic terms, that's called meruach, or otherwise known as digun. Those are synonymous terms. Meruach is translated into fancy English as winnowing. Bar is something that has the admixture of pieces of hay or straw. The Gemara tells us, ein bar below teven. You cannot have bar without an admixture of teven. And at this stage, it's no chiyuv trumas of maisros. It is so natural and so raw, so far away from being ochel, that it's not yet included in the parsha of trumas and maisros. Then we get to the next stage, which is called ochel. Ochel is the stage after meruach. What happens is they take the shibolim, they throw them up into the air, the wind carries away all this teven, and what's left falls onto a pan, and that's called dagon. And the Torah commands us to give to the Levi, to the Kohen, reishis dagoncha, after digun. So in Lomdisha terms, we would say that the machayev of Trumas and Maisros is meruach, or digun. And all this wheat or grains after digun falls into a pile. The pile is called a kri, chaf reish yud. And at that point, the chiyuv Trumas and Maisros begins. Now Reb Meir Simcha, having achieved his first goal and answered the first question, what's the difference between ochel and bar? And we'll read that inside. Ochel mikra es asher nismareach b'kri. It's after meruach. It's after the winnowing process. Now it fell into a kri, into a pile. Ubar hu atvuach shehi b'shibolim. Like, for example, Chazal say efshel bar b'li teven. It always has a mixture of teven inside of it because it's before meruach. Lachen, Omar, when he's feeding the people, this is going to be during the 7 years of plenty. Every household had to send its representative in front of Yosef to receive its ration of food. because that was Yosef's policy to ration the food during the 7 years of plenty, even though there was so much food to be had, but he rationed it out. By Yikvot says Kol HaOchel. And the pasuk goes on to say, Shevat Shanim Asher Hoyu Be'eretz Mitzrayim Vayiter Ochel Ba'arim Ochel Snei Ha'ir Asher Svivo Sa Nasan B'Tocha. There's a Nasan B'Tocha. B'Tocha means that in the city itself, Yosef is there to give out the rations of food, and he wants to give them food that's edible, that's almost at the last stage, ready to be converted into flour. Add the water, knead the dough, put it in the oven, and you've got your bread. So he offered the Mitzrim by distributing food, ochel, not bar. He didn't want to impose on them an entire process of winnowing. He wanted to shorten the period of time so that the people can get the food that they need on a daily basis, their ration, go home, bake their breads. The food is almost ready. It's after Meruah. And therefore, the Pasuk says, Vayikvat says, Kol HaOchel, and that's what he gave out to the people. Aval bar b'shibolim. Now we're talking about Yosef storing the food, not distributing the food. And there the Pasuk says, Vayitzbar bar kechol hayam. In other words, natural grains, stalks, as we call them, shibolim, last longer. I mean, you're gonna have to Google this and see the physics of it, but they have a longer stay, a lifespan than after Meruach. Take the bar and store it. That's where it says bar. Okay, now we get back to Yosef and his brothers. Lachein Amru, what was their goal? Why did they come to Mitzrayim? Lishbar Ochel. They wanted to buy rations of food, of grain, after winnowing. Why? So here, Rabbi Simcha, again, as I said, he puts on another hat. That's his Lamdasha halachic thinking hat. And based on an insight of the Vilna Gaon, he says the following. What the brothers were interested in was getting a large volume, as large as possible, of supply of food that would last them back in Eretz Canaan as long as possible, and they wouldn't have to come back to Mitzrayim to get more food. So their interest was to get the most amount of food. Now, don't ask me, did they give Truas and Mises? We'll come to that question in just a minute, but hold that off. They were obligated in the midst of Truas and Mises, but it all depends. We have something that's called Tfuas Aku. That means that you purchase grains from a non-Jew. If you are Jewish and you are a farmer, you raise your own grains, then for sure you're going to be chayiv in Truas and Mises. But if the grains were purchased from a guy, then when they come into Jewish possession, are they obligated in Truas and Mises? Does the Jew become a bar chiyuva vis-a-vis Truas and Mises, which again could be a sizable percentage of what you get? In the case of Meiser, it's certainly 10%. Truma is 2%, but it might be even more compounded than that. In any event, to avoid and circumvent the need for Trumas and Meisers, they had to buy Ochel from the Mitzvah. Why? If they would buy bar, they would take this bar back to Eretz Yisrael, to Eretz Canaan, and having possessed bar and now brought it to Eretz Canaan, we're going to now invoke the principle of the Vilna Gaon, who paskins in your day in the laws of Trumas and Meisers, that in such a case you're chayiv in Trumas and Meisers. Why? Because you as a Jew, A, did the Meiser Meiruach the Digun, and number two, you did it in Eretz Yisrael. If those two conditions are met, then you're chayiv in Trumas and Meisers. But if the guy in Chutz La'aretz implements Meiruach or Digun, then that machayev, that act or change in the status of the grains was done by a guy, in such a case, if you purchase from the guy, even if you take possession of that which was already subject to Meiruach and bring it back to Eretz Yisrael from Chutz La'aretz, you're not chayiv in Truvas of Maisus. Everything depends upon who did the Meiruach and where. The Achim had a vested interest in circumventing the mitzvah of Truvas and Maisus, because that would diminish the volume of their share of their ration of food. In order to expand that volume, what they wanted to do was get pure ochel. Now, what does ochel mean? As we said before, ochel means it's after Meiruach, which means that if they could buy from Yosef grains that were already subject to Meiruach, they are no longer going to be obligated in Trumas and Maisus. So they get everything, netto and bruto. Everything they take back with them to Mitzrayim is edible and doesn't have to be subject to Afrosh's Trumas and Maisus. Now we get to the other question. Would the brothers of Yosef take off Trumas and Maisus? Were they obligated that mitzvah before the Torah was given? Says Rabbi Simcha, L'chein amru lishbar ochel, ki alokeach. Lokeach means to purchase. Mishin is mareach. If you purchase grains after Meiruach, ought to be meiser. And that certainly applies in a case of grains that were A, grown in Chutz La'aretz, and B, they were subject to Meiruach already before they came into the possession of the Jew, and C, the Meiruach was implemented by a non-Jew. Aval Tfua mi Chutz La'aretz, habali Eretz. If you take Tfua from Chutz La'aretz, then you bring it to Eretz Yisrael, and if it's in a state of bar, which means terem before Meiruach, then you're chayav in Maisus min HaTorah, says the Vilna Gaon. And lochein ratzu likach ochel, they were asking for ochel, meaning after Meiruach, since the Meiruach took place by the hands of the guy in Chutz La'aretz, they would not be chayav in Truvas and Maisus when they came back to Eretz Canaan. However, Yosef had a different plan. The pasuk says, "Vayitzav Yosef vayimalu es kleihem bar." What is going on over here? They came to purchase ochel after Meiruach, and Yosef fills up their sacks with bar before Meiruach. Why? Kedeshi itztarchu liaser. Why did Yosef have a vested interest in wanting that the brothers should give maser? Kedeshi yimot min zonoseim v'yamaru loshu. Yosef had a scheme. His agenda was to see that the dreams and the prophecy would come to fulfillment, and that ultimately Yaakov would come down to Mitzrayim. His interest was to get the brothers from Eretz Canaan, after their supplies would be exhausted, back to Mitzrayim, and hopefully to bring Yaakov along with them, or at least to bring Binyamin along, and then at the next stage to get Yaakov down to Mitzrayim. So from Yosef's perspective, the quicker the pace of exhausting their provisions, the better it would be, because they would be forced and compelled to come back down to Mitzrayim. However, although in the first round, Yosef supplies them with bar, such that they'll have to give Trumas and Maestros, and we'll see in a minute why they're chayav in Trumas and Maestros. But Pama Shenis, after Yosef's whole ploy, where he hides the Gevia and the Amtachas, and then he tells his officers there to bring the brothers back and will throw him into jail. At that point, it says, Molei es Amtachas hanoshim ochel. All of a sudden, the storyline changes. When Yosef sent them back to Eretz Canaan, he sent them with bar. But when they were back in Mitzrayim, and they were caught red-handed as thieves, then Yosef fills up their sacks with bar. I'm sorry. Then Yosef fills up their sacks with ochel, which means after Meiruach. Why is that? He says, we have to add A plus B. A is that Yosef no longer had an interest in bringing them back to Mitzrayim from Eretz Canaan after exhausting their supplies as soon as possible, because he would incarcerate them in jail in Mitzrayim. And B, since they originally stated explicitly to Yosef that they had come down to Mitzrayim for Ochel, Yosef felt compelled to fulfill their request and give them Ochel. Because, after all, Yosef wanted to show himself to be a very moral person, and therefore he said, look, you asked for Ochel, I'm going to give you Ochel. He no longer at this point had the interest in sending them with bar so that they would become a bar chiyuva and trumas of maestros, and they would use up a sizable percentage of their supplies. Now, based on this, let's shed a new light on a pasuk that we'll read not this Shabbos, but next in Parshas Vayikra. At this point, Yosef is sending his brothers back to Mitzrayim. He's already revealed himself. The reconciliation has come about. He's now asking them to bring father Jacob down to Mitzrayim. And what does he send with the brothers? Take a look at the pasuk. The Eser Asonos Nosos Bar. So we have now these 10 mules that are carrying bar. But then it says, V'lechem umazon li'aviv laderech. And quite clearly, lechem umazon is ochel. Says Rabbi Simcha. Ben Nosam, as far as their trip is concerned, when they leave Mitzrayim on the journey to Eretz Canaan, that's going to take a good couple of days. And they need supplies to eat. He's going to send them with bar. Why? Because by sending them with bar, as long as they're in Chutz La'aretz, they're not chayiv in Trumas and Maasros, so they can eat the bar without any problem. And even if they would do the Meiruach, it would not be chayiv because it's still in Mitzrayim, it's in Chutz La'aretz. But now he's sending to Yaakov Avinu food that he wants Yaakov Avinu to be able to eat it immediately. So therefore he sends him lechem umazon la'achlam v'yosam v'eretz Mitzrayim, Israel. And now, as the clincher to round it all off, Rabbi Simcha answers the question, why were the brothers obligated in Trumas and Maasros? And the answer is, and this is based on Chazal in the Medrash, which the Rambam codifies in Hilchos Malachim, Yitzchak Avinu already established a mitzvah of Maaser. The Rambam derives from the pasuk by Yisro Yitzchak Mea Sha'arim. Yaakov also gave Maaser, as the pasuk says, Aser Asrenu Lach. So the original enactment of Maaser was that of Yitzchak. The brothers were therefore already chayav in Maasros from the time of Yitzchak's enactment. Yaakov strengthened that, and he fulfilled this, and he gave Maaser. Look how all the pieces of the puzzle fit together. There are like 5 different psukim with discrepancies and inconsistencies, and Reb Meir Simcha puts it all together. This is what I call a heavy piece. We go on to pasuk Yutes in the same parak. Achechem echad ye'aser bebeis mishmarchem. He says it's not right for me to take all the brothers and lock them up and not let them go back to Eretz Canaan, because one of them has to be held hostage until you can bring Binyamin down. Rabbi Simcha's medayek from the word echad. It doesn't say ha-echad. Ha-echad means when you specify one particular individual. Echad means anyone. Now, by saying anyone, Rabbi Simcha, if I could use a phrase from baseball or tennis, whatever it is throwing the ball back in their court. One of the brothers would have to remain locked up in jail, and it doesn't matter to me, says Yosef, which brother you choose. It's an anonymous one. From my perspective, says Yosef, draw lots, or choose one individual who will be the kapara hindle, he'll be the scapegoat, and he'll have to sit in jail until you can bring me Binyamin. Ezra Meir Simcha, that puts the brothers in a very delicate situation. And let's ask the following question. Supposing the enemy surrounds the city and they demand, give us one Jew, we'll know what to do with him. If not, we're going to raise the entire city and destroy the entire city. Do we choose one Jew to be the scapegoat, to be the, as we said before, the sacrifice, in order to save everyone else? And this is a unique Jewish moral principle. You won't find it in any other society. It's fact, a Mishnah in Meshech in the fourth parak, in the eighth parak. Seas b'nei Adam shayu holchem b'derech pagu b'hem goyim amru lehem tnu lanu echad mehem v'narogos v'im lav narogos kulka. The Mishnah paskins afilu nerogim kulam lo yimseru nefesh achas mi Yisrael. Those 5 words ring in any Jew who knows anything about halacha and Jewish morality knows these 5 words. Lo yimtzu lahem nefesh achas mi Yisrael. Now there is one exception to that rule, and that is what's called yichdu, which means that if the goyim want a certain individual and they mention him by name, then you're allowed to give him up. On this, there's a tremendous controversy in the Rishonim. According to the Rambam, it's got to be Yichdu Kesheva ben Bichri Asugin Sanhedrin. He's got to be someone who's Chayav Misa anyway. And other Rishonim, the Meiri, and others say no. If they want Yankel Beryl, you can give Yankel Beryl up in order to save the city. However, says Rameir Simcha, in this particular context, the word is echad. Echad means you choose one of them. And if we apply the principle of Jewish ethics formulated by the Mishnah Trumas to this situation, they would not be allowed to choose one brother to sit in jail to free all the other brothers. Unless, and here Rameir Simcha raises a possibility, but he rejects it outright. He says that if you take a look carefully, we're learning now Pasuk Yutes, but if you go back 2 Psukim, and in Pasuk Tezayin, it seems that Yosef's intention was to incarcerate all of them. Alo al pidin, kevan sheyasru kulam, al yimsu echad mem l'shevi. He says, on the one hand, how could it be that they could choose one particular brother instead of all of them sitting in the jail? Afal piche kan lo hayit tzorach lasos ma'isa. The below zeh hayu kulam b'mishpat. What happens in the following case? The Goyim take 10 Jews and they round them up and they're all incarcerated. The Jews in this case could choose one person and all 9 of the balance will simply get up and walk out of the door. Meaning the Ma'anes, the guy, is perfectly satisfied with one Jew. If you have to do an act of Masira, you have to take a Jew and transmit him over to the Goyim, that's prohibited under the law of the Mishnah. But Rameir Simcha questions, would it be possible halachically to passively give over one Jew? In other words, you're choosing one Jew, but you're not actively giving him over. Let the other 9 Jews who are incarcerated stand up and walk to their freedom. L'chora, that would be mutter. And in this case, since Yosef's intention was to incarcerate all 10, they theoretically could do a passive Masira, not an active Bekum Maseh, but a Shevi Altas. Below Zeh, you Kula B'Mishmar, they would all be incarcerated. Says Rav Meir Simcha, that's not an answer. That would not solve their dilemma, because Mikomakam Asarim Lo Yichduhu, he says we still require Yichduhu. They have to be in a situation where one particular Jew was called by name, he was singled out. That's the one the Goyim want. And in the absence of that, even if they will passively choose one Jew to give him up, that's prohibited. That's also considered a Masira, although not active and rather passive. Rabbi Simcha is not sure about this, and he adds a kolshkin. Kan, Heimadayin loyu asurit. Although it was the explicit stated intention of Yosef to incarcerate them all, but nevertheless, he had not yet done so at that point. Ubikesh sheyes har echad. He was asking, give us one of your people, and we will lock him up. So at this point, they weren't officially locked up, and they couldn't therefore pull off a Masira b'shei altas. So again, we would have to do a very serious research project to analyze what would be with the Masira b'shei altas in a case of lo yichduhu. Would they be allowed to choose one Jew? And Rabbi Simcha seems to vacillate about that point. But here in this case, they weren't all locked up together. Now, Rabbi Simcha wants to answer another question. Immediately after this episode, the Torah records the vidui of the brothers. And it says they Amru ish al echav, aval hashemim anachnu al achinu asher ra'inu tzaras nafsho b'schanu eleinu v'lo shaman. V'al kein bo eleinu hatzara hazos. And again, on a simple, shall I say, superficial level, one could argue that they were in such straits that one of their brothers would now be locked up, that they began to do tshuva. But Rabbi Simcha says, in the light of our discussion, it takes on a much more profound meaning. The contiguous or the context of Lachein Ba'aleinu Hatzara Zos is very profound in this context. Why? What happened? Yosef was crying to them, begging to them, and cruelly, without taking his chananus into consideration, they threw him into the bar and eventually sold him as an heir. They weren't concerned about one individual, namely their brother Yosef. And therefore, Eich nimsar echad mimenu. Yosef is asking us, you choose one of the brothers, one of your clan. I only said echad. I'm not asking for any specific brother. You make that decision and you give him over. The only way they could possibly solve this problem would be bilti ha'echad sheyimsar atzma v'daito le'osel manhitzil es achiv u'lerachim alakla. If one of the brothers would voluntarily step forward and offer himself to be the one who would be incarcerated so that the others would be freed, that's the only way they could get out of this predicament. Therefore, I thought I pressed this, but somebody who has to press it on his side. Okay. Anyway, so what happens now? They declare, we didn't have any compassion on Yosef. We're in such a tzara that the only way out of this tzara is that someone will have rachmanus and offer himself on behalf of them. You have to find someone who will be inspired to sacrifice himself for the sake of the klal. That's what Hashem is asking of us. He's asking us to somehow get to that level where we're willing to sacrifice ourselves for the benefit of the others. And now it's mita keneged mita. We weren't willing to have compassion on Yosef, despite his chananus, and we sold him cruelly, without any concern for his situation. And now we're in a position where we have to somehow find the compassion in our hearts, and each one has to ask himself if he's going to be the one to offer himself. Says Rabbi Simcha in the next pasuk, it says, "L'chein bacha Yosef." Yosef turns to cry. Vayedaber aleihim, and then he spoke to them. Why was Yosef crying? And again, you can give many answers to that question. Rabbi Simcha has his own unique answer in the sequence that he's presented. Yosef now realizes that if his goal is to get one of them to be incarcerated so that he can free the rest, the other 9, he would have to make that choice decision. He's the one who would have to be mavarer and point his finger at one of them. Shekosha lahem livar esa echad. They don't know how to choose one, therefore they're throwing the ball back into my court. I have to choose one. Who be atzmo yivar v'kacheu v'yasreu. That's what caused Yosef to break down when he realized that now he, in order to achieve his goal, would have to choose one of the brothers. He would, in effect, have to violate the law of the Mishnah in Trumos and choose one brother. Let's take a look at the next presentation of Rameir Simcha, and we'll sort of round it off with that. The brothers start looking at each other at this point when they begin a profound process of tshuva, of repentance, Hashemim anachnu, and ra'inu tzaras nafsho b'tzchanu eleinu v'lo shamanu, and now they start blaming one the other. Reuven gets up and he says that I told you, al techtu b'yelet. Don't sin with this yelet. Now, Yosef was 17 years old at that age, at that time. And yet, Reuven called him a yelet. What's the emphasis here on the word yelet? There is a difference here between the legal system in the courts down here, human courts, and the system up in the heavenly courts. In Dine Adam, down on earth, if a person is found guilty with Adam and Asra of a crime, he's just a lad of 13 years old, he will be punished. However, B'din Shamayim, it's a whole different story. If, according to the law, strict letter of the law, he's not to be punished, for whatever technical reason, he's chayav b'din Shamayim, but din Shamayim will only punish a person who is 20 years old. Ad esrim shana eino chayav. Now, Yosef falls in between the cracks. He's beyond 13, but he's younger than 20. And the source for this discussion about din Shamayim and din Adam is in Yerushalmi and Bikurim. Od nafkamina, he says there's another fundamental difference between din Shamayim and dine Adam, and that is that b'dine Adam danin al shem sofa. It's an amazing rule that applies even dine Adam. In fact, only in dine Adam, that you could judge a person and condemn them, as we'll see later in the parsha of Ben Soru Morer, based on the future. Al Shem Sofa. What's going to happen to this lad later on? And we're going to stone him in the parsha of Ben Soru Morer. Another parsha is Baba Machteres, where a person, a burglar, comes into your house, and you know that if you protect your money, he will kill you. He's an armed robber, and therefore you are allowed to take the law into your hands, the initiative, and kill him first. However, the opposite is true in Dinei Shamayim. Ein manishim ala osid. And this is based on a principle in Yishmael, because the pasuk says Basheru Sham, and the Gemara Shana says that at that point Yishmael was okay; he hadn't yet gone off the path, and therefore God had mercy on Yishmael, because in the heavenly courts they judge you and they punish you. The justice is based on what's now, not on the future. If that be the case, we can begin to understand the machlokas here between Reuven and his brothers in terms of Yosef. What was the opinion of the brothers? Hema Danu Yosef Kamo Rodef. They felt that in Dine Adam, they had the license to kill Yosef. And that's based on halach of Rodef. Rodef means Nidon al ha'asir al shem sofa. This person is threatening to kill someone. We have the right and even the obligation to put him to death. And this is based on the pasuk, says Rabbi Simcha. How do I know that the brothers classified Yosef as a Rodef? The pasuk says when Yosef is coming towards the brothers, B'terem yikrav aleim vayisnaklu oso lehamisa. And he says that vayisnaklu oso b'terem yikrav aleim, meaning the emphasis here is that he's getting closer, and they want to get there b'terem before he gets too close. That's exactly the halach of a rodef. He's on his way. He's threatening his victim to murder the victim. Get there before he gets too close. And therefore, vayisnaklu, they decided that he would be put to death as a rodef. And again, that applies in Dinei Adam. Lefi dinam, chayachayiv misa b'terem yikrav alem lasos lem ra al shem sofo, shehu mechapes alilos alem la misam. He wants to destroy. Yosef has a plan to destroy them, and whether it means in this world or the next world. V'zeu derech melitza, comes along Reuven, and he says, no, no, no. You're making a major mistake. And why is that? Because Eino mechashev lasos ra. He is not planning and scheming to do evil to you. You are misjudging him. You are talking about Al Shema Asid. You define and classify Yosef as a rodef. He's not a rodef. Again, he's guilty of many sins. Vayavi dibasam ra laviyem. You could judge him on his past sins, but you cannot judge him Al Shem Sofo, because according to Reuven's evaluation, they were wrong. Eino mechashev lasos ra. And therefore, al techtu bayelin. Here's the emphasis on the word yelin. Rak masha'ava kfar. You can therefore only judge them in a bezdin shalmata, in our human courts, b'dinei adam, on what he has already, the crimes that he's already perpetrated. And in the case of Yosef, you want to punish him for whatever crimes he did. He's not a rodef. He's certainly not chayav misa. You have no right to put him to death. The only thing is that although we couldn't put him to death, but nevertheless, we could judge him in Din Shamayim. And in Din Shamayim, as we said before, we could judge him even for thoughts, even if technically he would not be chayav, and we could judge him in Dinei Adam only for the past, and his past record does not generate any sort of punishment. He may have had ill intention, dibasam ra, but that doesn't generate a punishment in Bezdin Shal Adam, in Dinei Adam. But he could be judged in the Bezdin Shal Mal. The only problem is, as we said at the outset, Bezdin Shal Mala will only punish a person when he reaches the age of what, Rabbosai? 20. He is a yeled. He's only 17 years old. And therefore, since lo asa maisa, he's not guilty in the past of any maisa, so you can't punish him down in a Bezdin Shal Mata. Al Shema Asin, Reuven disagrees and he claims that Yosef had no intention of doing Ra, he's not a Rodef. Ella what? For his evil actions and thoughts and Dibasam Ra, he can be Chayiv V'Din Shamayim, but there's only one problem. He's less than 20 years old. B'Domo Nidrash, Shekota V'Din Shamayim, he's too young. He may be a Gadol, having reached the age of 13 in Dini Adam, but in Dini Adam we can't punish him. He can only be punished in Din Shamayim, but in Din Shamayim he's a Katan. And I'm going to prove it to you, says Reuven. Haraya, Shehishlich Oso Bibar, and what was in that bar? Bechashim Vakravim. According to the laws of nature, Yosef should have died in the bottom of the bar. Below Huzak, he wasn't touched. He wasn't even scratched. No harm occurred to him. He's a katan in Din Shamayim, and therefore, up to the age of 20, he is a katan. Okay, Rabbi, say this is where we're going to stop. If anyone has any questions, I'm here for you now. I would like to give a very quick overview for those who want to stay another 5 minutes of what we covered today in Rameir Simcha. First of all, we had the insight of why Paro had vested interest in appointing Yosef as the second in command. That would glorify him. Secondly, how did Paro know that Yosef was the superior intellect, the greatest mind in that generation? Thirdly, why was Paro motivated to give Asnat, the daughter of Potiphar, as a wedding partner to Yosef? Number 4, why is it that the word Amar is omitted in the declaration of Yosef in the choice of the name Menashe? Number 5, why do we find that the brothers asked for Ochel and Yosef instead gives them Bar? And why does the word Bar show up here and there and then Ochel? What's the difference between the two? And then the difficult dilemma that the brothers find themselves in the fact that they were called upon by Yosef to choose one brother, and that's in violation of the Mishnah in Shrumos. And then we understand exactly why they recited their vidui immediately after this horrendous episode. And finally, we understood why Reuven disagrees with his brothers. And he tells them, I told you, don't do this to a Yeled, because he's only chayav for whatever ill intention that he had against them in Din Shamayim, and he was a Yeled, he was less than 20 years old. Okay then? So with that, I bid you au revoir. That's for Jackie. And a Shabbat Shalom. Have a great Shabbos, Parshas, Miketz.